Greetings, YouTube. I was recently looking at the game Vert, V-U-R-T. I can't remember why. Somebody suggested it somewhere, or I don't, or maybe it might even be that I read it was the core mechanic in another system I looked at. I don't remember. I know that I've looked at the system, and then as I'm reading it, I'm going like, this sounds really familiar, and I began to really think I was looking at the original, and I had looked at an offshoot at some point in the recent past. And one of the things that struck me is the punitive nature of the mechanics. So if you want to do something in this system, you're going to have a fairly difficult time achieving it. However, if you've taken the right kind of edges, uh, abilities from either your career background or from your species background, or the right kind of uh, enhancements and things that you're actively spending to pay down that punitive mechanic, eventually it gets easier. In fact, the mechanic is kind of interesting. Is that you can actually say if you're trying to hit a target with a melee attack, you can actually pay it down to the point where your chance of failure is zero. You will not have to roll. You will just succeed, which is, I don't think I've ever encountered it that explicitly before. I mean, we've all encountered a system where you had such an unbelievably overwhelming bonus that the possibility that you would fail is essentially zero, but it was never zero. Rarely does, for example, under the D20 system, is it you're never going to fail. There are exceptions. For example, you could take 10 if you're against any kind of skill, if you're a bard of some variety. So you could, so long as you have a skill uh, score high enough ranks, if you take 10, you could automatically make every single roll because your average, you know, resistance you're getting with the challenge rating is not going to matter. But that's the exception. That's not going to happen all that often. Most of the time, under a D20 system, you're rolling a D20, which means you always have a 5% chance of fail. Doesn't matter if you're God. You have a 5% chance of failing with every single roll. I realize that gods and interacting with mortals, the god's always going to win. I get that. But the point is that there's always that 5% chance you're going to fail, no matter what level you are. A 1 is always going to be, down the crapper. You failed at that one. Just like a 20 isn't necessarily going to be you're always going to get the best results, even though it is technically a success. If you're facing someone who's really tough, your success may still not do much. But I don't think I've ever seen a mechanic that said flat out you can pay down the challenge to the point where it's zero. If anyone else has seen something out there like that, I'd like to know. Um, but I come to realize as I was reading this, and then I realized that, like, oh, I've read these mechanics before, so I stopped reading it. I moved on to something else. I think I'm looking at Crypts and Things because somebody asked me to suggest that I want to look at that. It's based on sword and wizardry, and boy, am I having feels about that so far. Um, I don't like the punitive structure. I don't like a system that comes out of the gate saying, okay, this is how hard it's going to be. But if you're willing to expend player, player currency, and you're going to be able to, like, put your species points into something and your class points into something and your luck pool or whatever, and you're pushing it down to the point where you will succeed or have a very high percentage of succeeding, but only if you spend all of these different build points and character structures and things to push that number down. And if you don't push that number down, the system is going to punish you every single time you want to make that roll. That bugs me. I much rather have a mechanic that says, here's the target. These are the bonuses or penalties that you have based on circumstances or your character's build. Make it, equal it, or go higher. That's it. And so it's rather than rather than going downward, pushing the DC down, you're being told that you have a bonus because of your high dex and you're really good at stealth and you are a night elf, and you get the point. And it's a moonless night, which is in to your advantage. I'd rather have that positive than the negative. I prefer that positive structure to the punitive structure. much like I prefer to have an AC high rather than the old school armor class low. Yes, there was a time in D&D where the lower your armor class number, the better off you were and the harder you were to hit. Now, speaking those words out loud from the year 2024, it seems absurd. Why did we do that? It made no sense to me in retrospect. At the time, we didn't question it. It's just the way the rules were written. You didn't question how the rules were written. Most of us just kind of took them as gospel. Remember that the Church of Gygax was strong at one time. Um, but now I'm like, well, why would you do that? Why isn't higher better? Because just an example, I think of a tank. I don't think, well, the tank with less armor is going to be harder to damage than the tank that has more armor. Yes, I realize that in the old rules, the tank with the lower armor class is the one with more armor than the one at the higher armor class. That just doesn't make any sense in my head anymore. You know, and then of course you throw in their reactive armor and things just go. The sky's the limit. Um, but I really don't like the punitive mechanic structure, and I know I'm not alone in this because a lot of folks really embraced the third edition change to going to a positive armor class and having a unified mechanic where everything was uh, the same across the board. So you were always trying to equal or beat a DC challenge. There weren't inconsistent mechanics for one type of skill as opposed to a different kind of skill. There actually was a functioning skill system. Saving throws were based off of something that made sense instead of every single different type of thing that you could potentially save against would have a different number depending on your character class and your level. Yeah, there were how many saving throws were there back in the old days? It was an absurd number. And the thieves back when they were called thieves and the thieves skill charts were just crazy cakes. Like they were all percentiles. Well, there wasn't any skill system really for much anything else. Um, as opposed, but it's all percentiles based in a system that was very much based on D20. Having the unified mechanic that third edition came forward was a breath of fresh air, and it still is to this day. But it's kind of interesting to me that there are still people in the 20, we're a quarter of the way through this century who are still developing punitive mechanic systems and somehow think that that is the best way of going. It certainly is counterintuitive to me. So let's is it counterintuitive to you? Do you prefer a unified system that is positive, or do you prefer a punitive system where you're paying down a target number, a challenge rating, to the point where you could conceivably not have to roll at all? Because again, I don't think I've seen that before, where combat could be negated simply because you are so awesome. But again, you probably couldn't be awesome for every single combat because you have a limited pool of player currency to spend. Yes, you get the point. So yeah, let's talk about punitive mechanics. I don't like it. How do you feel about it?